So the next thing is like, what are all the different checks that will happen when a transaction code is executed in your SAP system?
Okay.
Okay. So in ECC, it is all transaction codes. So in BI, it is not the case. Okay, so we hardly use transaction codes. So it is just certain queries, you execute them based on your access, you will be getting that particular data. But ECC being a transaction oriented system, everything is driven through transactions. Okay, so transaction code, I would say something like a command to the system. Okay, but you have a number of transaction codes in the system based on the different modules in ECC.
Yeah.
What are the different checks that will internally happen when a T code is executed? Okay, so there are different level of checks that will happen. Some of them are at the kernel level and some of them are dependent on what authorizations are assigned to the user. Okay. So when you execute a transaction, the first check that will happen is, so in SAP there is one table that will hold what are all the list of executable transaction codes in the system. This is the table. I'm assuming you know how to access tables. Okay, so we use SE16. So this is the table that will hold the list of all executable transactions in the system. So
Okay.
whether it is a standard transaction or a custom transaction. So if it is a custom transaction, okay, so the developers have to make sure that there is an entry in this particular table.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So TSTC is the table. So if I just say number of entries here, so I'm getting around 1.5 lakh transactions.
Yeah.
Because this is an ECC system, you see such a big number. But if you go to other solutions, so this number will get drastically reduced. Okay. So any
Okay.
standard or a custom transaction, the system will first look at this particular table. So this is a kernel level check. Okay.
Okay.
So there has to be an entry in TSTC. So only then the system will proceed to the next level of check. Okay.
Okay.
So for example, there has to be an entry here. Okay. So what is the associated ABAP program for SU01? So I have to get this particular results.
Okay.
Okay. So this is the first level of check that will happen. Once this is passed, so the next level of check is whether the T code is locked or not.
Okay.
So when you say T code is locked, so it is actually a valid transaction which is there in TSTC, but you are stopping the user from executing that in the system.
Okay.
Okay, so for example, you do not want to execute a certain transaction for a user. So you have an option of locking that in SM01.
Yeah.
Okay. So this access is normally given to basis. Okay. So SM01 is restricted for security. So here you can check what all transactions are locked or not. So if it is locked, even though it is valid, you will not be able to execute that in the system.
Okay.
So this is actually a bad practice, to be frank. Okay, so we should not lock the transactions. If a transaction is not required and a business does not want that to be executed by the users, okay, so the easiest option is to remove from the roles. because access to
Okay.
all these transactions will be given in the form of roles. Okay, so just
Yeah.
remove the transaction code from the underlying roles. It is not a good practice to lock them.
Okay.
Okay, so this is normally used in case you have gone live. Okay, and the business immediately comes up with an option saying these transactions have to be locked. Okay, so you don't have time to make the changes in development and move it until production. So as a quick turnaround, you ask basis to lock them in the system until the role is modified and it is moved to production. Okay, but
Okay.
I would say this is not a good practice.
Okay.
Okay, this is again a kernel level check, SM01. So the next two are a user level check. Okay, it depends on what authorizations are assigned to the users. So the third step is the system will check whether the user is authorized to execute the transaction. Okay, so for this, the user will check a specific object. Okay, so we call that as authorization objects. So we will see the concept of authorization in detail when we come to role administration.
Okay. Okay.
This is the object that will be checked, yes underscore T code. So this means transaction code. Okay. So this is the description of S underscore T code. Okay.
Okay.
So this will have a field called TCD. Field. This is not a transaction. So whatever transaction you are executing should be maintained as a field value under this object. Okay. So
Okay.
if you are executing AC38, that means you need to have a role, these authorizations. Whatever it is. So anything that you execute, the first level of check is you should have this particular authorization assigned to you.
Okay.
Okay. So this is a user level check. So we will see this in detail. Okay. So what exactly is an object? So what is a field? So what is an authorization and all? So this is just
Okay.
at a high level that I'm telling you. Okay.
Okay.
Right. So when you talk about transactions, so there will be n number of objects linked to a particular transaction. So security is all about authorizations. So if you want to see like what are all the trans objects linked to a particular transaction, so you will be using this transaction SU24. Okay.
Okay.
So this is too early for you. So I just want to show you how it is linked, but we will see this in detail when we come to role administration. So
Okay.
let us say you want to see what are all the objects linked to SA38. Okay. So key in your transaction code and say execute. So these are the objects that are linked to AC38. Okay.
Okay.
So S develop S program and all.
Okay.
Okay. But for you to just execute a transaction, you don't need all of this. Okay. So SAP only checks for a minimal authorization when you are executing. Okay.
Okay.
So when the transaction execution is successful and when you're trying to do further activities, there will be further authorization checks. Okay. But when you are just starting a transaction, you just require some minimal authorizations. So that is there in another table. If you see here, there is a column which is called as TSTCA. Okay. And it clearly says check a transaction. Okay. So there is a symbol here. So this is the only object that is checked when you are executing SA38. So this is what is called as minimal authorization. Okay, so it says object is checked at start. But for the other objects, you don't have that symbol. That means that you don't need all of them when you are just executing SA38, no matter any transaction that you are executing. So TSTCA will give you what is the minimal objects that should be there as part of your role for you to execute the transaction.
Okay.
Okay. So this is again a user level check.
Okay.
As the minimal authorizations required. there in another table, which is TSTCA. So once these four checks are successful, so this thing you should already be familiar. So in AC93, you can see what is the corresponding program that is linked to a transaction code. Okay. So every T code has to be linked to a program. Correct. So once all the checks are successful, you have to get a corresponding screen for that particular transaction code. Okay. And you should be able to execute all the activities, which is again further restricted using authorizations. Okay. So in AC93, based on what program is linked to that particular transaction, so you will get the corresponding screen. Okay. So these are the different checks that will happen when you execute a transaction code. Okay.
Okay.
So this too is something technical. Okay. So in case you don't understand now, that's fine. So we will see this in detail when we come to role administration. Okay. But at a high level, you just have to understand that there are certain user level checks also involved when a T code is executed. But the system will expect only certain minimal authorizations, which is available in TSTCA.
Okay.
Okay. This is one category, and you also need to have that particular transaction code assigned to you as an authorization for this object TST code.
Okay.
Okay.
So these T code checks need to be done when that is these T code should be assigned to a role or not. Like right, sir?
Yeah, sorry, your voice is very low.
No, this T code checks that is to be done when we need to add a specific T code to a role for a user, right?
Yes, so yes, once this T code, you cannot directly assign transaction codes to users. It has to go
Okay,
into a role, and once you assign a role to a user, so these two checks will come into picture.
okay,
Okay,
okay, okay.
3 and 4. So 1,
So
2,
what?
and 5
Uh,
check. So that is a kernel level check, but 3 and 4 will depend on what role is assigned to you.
okay.
Here you have any questions?
No, no, not. Sir,
Okay.
on ASAP methodology, so these these steps. What are the role of security guys in these steps?
Okay, so it depends on your experience whether you will be involved in design or not. So let us say you have to do the security design, right?
Okay,
So what role type you will be using, so how you will be designing the authorization concept. Okay. So that will be done as part of your blueprint. So in realization, coming to security, you will be doing your role build. So let us say you are building
okay,
roles for finance, you are building roles for controlling accounts payable,
okay,
accounts receivable for the different processes and different departments or the different actors you have as part of the department. You will be doing your role build based on the
okay,
authorization design that you have analyzed in the blueprint. So you will
okay,
test that,
okay,
you that. Okay, so that is how it goes in a security implementation.
okay, okay.
Okay. Any other question?
No, no.
Okay. Okay, fine then. So we will stop here for today. So there are a few more concepts. I'll be
Okay,
completing them tomorrow and then start with the actual topics.
sure. Okay,
Okay.
yeah.